Welcome to Military Analytics. The steppes of Eastern Europe continue to resonate with the Ukrainian cries of freedom. Russia is learning perhaps the hardest lesson in its history on the territory of Ukraine. The attacks of the Russian army in eastern Ukraine were thwarted by the strong resistance of the Ukraine. With the advance of the Russian army at a standstill, Vladimir Putin began to look for alternative solutions. Putin is knocking on Lukashenko and China, but he can't get what he wants. Western warnings and sanctions on Belarus are reducing Lukashenko's influence in the Ukraine war. On the other hand, Russia is turning to China due to military ammunition deficiencies and production impossibilities. But so far China has not responded to the Russian army's lack of ammunition. Any country that helps the Russian army in this regard does not risk facing heavy economic sanctions from the West. On the other hand, increasing Turkey's power in the Black Sea, Poland's control of the Belarusian border by increasing its power on the Kaliningrad border and closing the Belarusian borders, limits Russia's aggressive moves towards Eastern Europe. In addition, Finland in the far north is now a member of the NATO alliance, and Russia has lost its menacing trump card there. At the moment we see that Biden, Erdogan, Macron, von der Leyen, and Marcellus Morawiecki are working hard to limit and control the moves of Putin and Lukashenko. On the other hand, we see in Zelensky that Putin took critical steps to limit his moves in Ukraine and to corner the Russian army. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Goluzin suggested that the draft peace treaty proposes to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, but that guarantees can only be provided in conjunction with other conditions. Commenting on Ukraine's prospects for accession to the European Union, Goluzin claimed that in the past few years, the bloc has transformed from an independent, neutral association for economic integration to a militarized international entity hostile to Russia. In fact, this was the proof of how isolated Russia has become from the world with its unjust occupation policies. Because, as you know, Finland had recently joined the NATO military alliance, creating the possibility of disrupting Russia's invasion plans for Ukraine. Both countries, with a 1340-kilometer border, are militarily adequate. Now Finland is becoming a full NATO member from being Russia's buffer zone was a historic decision that dragged the Russians into a quagmire from a diplomatic point of view. On the other hand, with Finland's accession to NATO, the Russian Navy is likely to experience serious difficulties in the Baltic Sea. Currently, the bold and strict policies of Estonia on this issue and the maneuvering abilities of Russian Navy members in the Baltic were severely restricted. But in our opinion, if we evaluate all this data, the two countries that have the most capacity to hinder Russia's plans in Ukraine are the USA and Turkey. First of all, if we look at the US side, the nearly $50 billion military and financial aid provided by the Biden administration to the Ukrainian army is one of the most concrete proofs of this. In addition, it seems that the US's latest sending of Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine will change the balance in the war. In addition to military aid, the United States is characterized as the primary country to block Russia's use of nuclear weapons because Washington succeeds in neutralizing the Russian Navy, which is equipped with nuclear-tipped missiles by Russian leader Vladimir Putin, both in the Mediterranean and in the Indo-Pacific maritime areas. In addition, the U.S. Navy forces, which draws attention to the recent military activity of Russia in the Sea of Japan and is a deterrent in this regard, is doing its duty for now. The U.S. is not blocking this threatening Russian presence just to protect Ukraine or Taiwan and guarantee their freedom. The USA carries out all these efforts to eliminate the emergence of New World Order under the threat of Russia and China. In addition, the Washington administration recently announced that it has achieved a total of $58 billion in revenue by applying one of the largest sanctions in its history to Russia. After this striking statement, where this income will be used has attracted much more attention. Indeed, Washington claimed that $58 billion in revenue from the sanctions imposed on Russia could be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine. If that happens, all the efforts that Russian leader Vladimir Putin has tried so far will be in vain. Putin will only wear out his army and citizens for nothing. Currently, the war strategy of the Russian leader so far has also dragged his army and nation into a period of complete collapse. But if Putin persists in his invasion plans for Ukraine, much worse days will await Russia. Besides the USA, another country that has the potential to discourage the Russian leader from the invasion of Ukraine is Turkey. As we mentioned, there are many reasons why Turkey is in this different position. Let's start with the strategic location of this country, which is one of the rulers of the Middle East. Geography. Turkey is currently described as a bridge between Asia and Europe. Turkish leader Erdogan has wisely used this strategic position to moderate the policies of Russian leader Vladimir Putin since the beginning of the war. If you remember, the last Turkish leader, Erdogan, solved the crisis regarding the Black Sea grain corridor agreement, again, thanks to his critical mediator role. With the expiration of the agreement on May 18th, a new crisis is expected. However, we can witness the unifying and conciliatory role of Turkey on this issue. Again, Erdogan can convince Putin again about the grain deal and bring him to the table for this issue. Besides the grain agreement, Turkey has now taken a new step to dissuade Russia from this war. Erdogan had a meeting with Putin. In a phone call with Putin, Erdogan demanded the end of the Ukraine war. This was a clear warning. Some people considered this as the last ultimatum from Turkey to Russia. But Turkey's move on this issue was quite logical. The Ankara government wanted the war to end, but was also considering the interests of Europe and its own non-natural gas and energy. Europe has already had bad times over the past winter due to the embargo decisions that Russia tried to implement in order to avoid such a situation again. Turkey is trying to lead Russia to a more peaceful path. In fact, Erdogan's undertaking this task is a good advantage for the countries of the world. The reason for this is the recognition of the Turkish president by many countries around the world, and, most importantly, Putin's sensitive approach to Erdogan. In recent years, both countries have experienced volatile relations with economic cooperation and common interests in Syria, regional clashes that conflict with different restrictive perspectives, such as regional security. But no matter what, the relationship between the two was not damaged too much, as Erdogan was in a deterrent position and Turkey was one of the strongest military forces in the Middle East and Europe. Especially considering that Accession nuclear power plant has come to the fore recently. Russian leader Vladimir Putin can never take the risk of undermining this cooperation. Kirill Komarov, deputy general manager of the Russian public nuclear energy company Rosatom, which will build Turkey's first nuclear power plant, announced that the seismic studies for the Accession nuclear power plant have been completed and that the power plant will be officially put into operation in 2023. For this reason, Russia's follow-up of a policy that Turkey does not approve of may tighten the ropes between the two countries. As we all know, the possibility of Putin not being able to take this risk is based on the Ukraine war. Since the Russian economy does not have the resources to invest in its own defense industry at the moment, it can never ignore the economic income it will provide from an important country like Turkey. But Turkey's stance on this issue is quite clear. Turkey still keeps both the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles closed to Russian warships. In addition, Turkey wants this war to end at least as much as the United States. Whatever the economic relations between Russia and Turkey, Erdogan and the Turkish administration's approach to Russia versus Ukraine is clear. Erdogan has proven this very clearly by the Turkish administration's bringing a brand new power to the Black Sea, TCG and Anadolu amphibious aircraft carrier, and by building the flagship of the Ukrainian Navy. In summary, Turkey is still a brave ally of Ukraine. The battlefield in Ukraine has been the scene of moments that can be counted as an action movie, especially in recent days. Midnight ambush operations. Mind-bogglingly successful attacks by Ukrainian armed forces, snipers, and the Ukrainian army's new secret weapon. All of these were perhaps the most interesting and exciting moments of the war that took place this week on Ukraine's eastern front lines. In addition, the breathtaking attack and defense clashes in the industrial zone of Bakhmut were examples of the war strategy of the Ukrainian army that could go down in history. Let's dive into the eastern front lines of Ukraine, where these striking moments of breaking were experienced without wasting time. The eastern front lines of Ukraine have become a place of fire. Wagner forces are trying to strengthen their trenches in the industrial zone in Bakhmut and expand their offensive positions in the areas between the Ukrainians and the connecting roads. In order to prepare for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, which they expect to begin at any moment. In addition, the Russian army stationed almost half of all its forces in the Donetsk region, and these Russian military forces included Wagner mercenaries. The Ukrainians were attacking the Russians from the opposite direction in the industrial zone of Bakhmut, destroying everything in their path with all their military might. Recently, soldiers from the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service launched a counterattack on Russian troops in this hot front line and in the production workshop of one of the Bakhmut-based industrial enterprises. The Ukrainian Border Guard eliminated a group of Russian Wagner mercenaries. Ukrainian border guards then used the SPG-9 recoilless cannon to destroy the Russian military cluster, neutralizing a Russian machine gunner who was watching the factory building where they were located. The Russians were then forced to retreat as they could not enter the factory for a certain period of time. There was a whole action movie scene going on here. While the Ukrainians were trying not to let the Russians into the factory building they were in, the Russians were waiting for a suitable moment to attack in the area close to the factory. This wait of the Russians lasted until midnight. With the fall of darkness, the Ukrainian border guards set up a critical ambush for the Russian reserve units in the Bakhmut industrial area. The Russian attack teams approaching the factory building where the Ukrainians were located encountered a great surprise in this way. In the dead of night, the rifles of Ukrainian snipers who were waiting in ambush in the Bakhmut industrial area began to explode, while the pitch black of the night was illuminated by the fire from the rifles of the Ukrainian snipers. 10 Russian soldiers in total died in one night as a result of this striking ambush operation. This striking success by the Ukrainians in the industrial zone of Bakhmut has also managed to drastically change the situation in the city. One of the most important events around the city was that the Ukrainians built a pontoon bridge at Kremova. If you remember, the Ukrainians destroyed the bridge here while the Russians were advancing rapidly because the Ukrainians wanted to complicate the advance of the Russians if they were expelled from here. The fact that the Ukrainians had built a new pontoon bridge here indicated that they had driven the Russians far enough from Kremova and had started to use the main road connecting to Bakhmut again. It will also be much more difficult for the Russians to intercept Ukrainian military support to Bakhmut, as the Ukrainians have more connecting routes available to them. On the other hand, the first reason the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians back in this region was that they had drawn them into a trench warfare thanks to the clashes that took place in the factory building, which we mentioned in the video in the industrial zone of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians actually managed to throw the Russians into a ring of fire. The Russians wanted to continue their activities in the Bakhmut industrial area after the Ukrainians in the city were defeated at the factory used for defense. The Russian troops stopped. This time was the Azov industrial area in Bakhmut. Russian soldiers began to attack the industrial areas here. This was one of the most fortified places in the city. We can compare this industrial area to the Azovstal factory in Mariupol. There are many factories here and there are dozens of secret passages and bunkers underground. For this reason, the Russians need a huge military resource to try to seize this place. For this reason, the Azov industrial plant after the other industrial building in Bakhmut is a very suitable fortification area for the Ukrainians to make their next defense. The Wagner forces, along with Russian soldiers, have been carrying out dozens of offensive operations every day this week to seize the small industrial zone and drive the Ukrainians out of the industrial zone they are defending. So almost 40% of clashes around Bakhmut occur here. Not surprisingly, the successes of the Ukrainians in this industrial area have reduced Russian operations in other regions. In fact, at first glance, it is somewhat surprising that the Wagner forces abandoned their advance on Kremov because the Wagner group had deployed their most elite troops here to besiege Bakhmut. But the Ukrainians are also preparing to carry out a counter-style operation in this region. Thus, the Ukrainian forces suddenly want to hunt down the weakened Russian troops and Wagner elite forces, which have come out of their defensive position in the industrial zone and suffered heavy losses. And for this purpose, another of the main centers of focus of Ukrainians is the region around the Sloviansk Highway. Many Russian sources think that in the event of a Ukrainian counterattack, the main direction of attack will be formed along this highway. On the other hand, there is information that the Ukrainians have gathered a noticeable force in the Mankivka region. Considering the situation, we see that the Russians are trying to create as big a defensive shield as possible in order to secure their wings in this region. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, carried out a massive attack in the opposite direction while all this was happening a few days ago. There was a big explosion in the Kolomychka. Later, it turned out that the Ukrainians were testing new JDAM bombs in this region. Again, after these striking attacks, officials of the Donetsk People's Republic reported that Ukrainian forces destroyed Russian military resources in Kolomychka using JDAM bombs. JDAM is a type of guided bomb that can accurately destroy targets within approximately 40 kilometers. According to the data obtained, a single bomb used by the Ukrainian forces completely destroyed the Russian assembly centers in Kadymia. So only 10 of these bombs can clear the city of Kadymia and give the Ukrainians a great view. If the Ukrainians can capture the hills of the city and bring their military equipment there, the Wagner forces may be in great danger. All these events show us that very severe clashes may occur in the eastern front lines of Ukraine, especially in Bakhmut and its surroundings. For this reason, Ukrainians should use their military ammunition strategically and fulfill their missions where it is necessary to defend, and should not waste time in areas where they will be attacked. Russia's heavy losses in the Donetsk region, especially in and around the city of Bakhmut, caused a serious setback. However, although the Russians suffered heavy losses, they were able to carry out offensive actions against the Ukrainians. Again, thanks to the Wagner forces they used in the battlefield in and around Bakhmut. Although the losses of the Russian army are ignored by the Kremlin administration and Russian leader Vladimir Putin, the situation is very serious because Russian troops are under serious pressure, not only on the eastern front lines of Ukraine, but also in all areas where clashes took place. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have already turned this situation to their advantage. In other words, Ukrainians get much more effective results by first waiting for the right moment and then attacking the Russians. In fact, the secret is precisely this method of warfare used by the Ukrainian forces. The side that first waits for the opponent's most vulnerable moment and then attacks at the appropriate moment always comes out of the clashes much more advantageous. In short, if we consider the general state of the war in recent days, if Russia continues its reckless counterattacks, the unstoppable domination of the Ukrainian forces, which spreads in waves, will engulf the whole country. Bakhmut, which is in a lively and critical position like the city of Stalingrad in World War II, continues to be the most critical front line of the Ukraine-Russia war. So what brought Bakhmut to such an important position? And to what extent did the latest situation in the city bring the war? Let's dive right into this 41-kilometer hell line. First of all, we need to state that the Bakhmut war has been going on for more than 7 months as both sides of the war concentrated their military forces in this city. Bakhmut, which was initially seen as insignificant in a strategic sense, suddenly gained serious importance. Also, the human loss in the fight for Bakhmut is quite surprising, although the amount of territory taken and its strategic value are at a minimum. Fierce clashes still continue in Bakhmut, which has become the stronghold of the war. Russian leaders began to claim that their military forces now control eastern Bakhmut, the small city in eastern Ukraine, where the war's longest and most brutal battle was fought. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Russian mercenary group Wagner, announced that his fighters had captured eastern Bakhmut. But contrary to these statements, the situation in the city is still uncertain. The numerical data of the battle for Bakhmut also refute the claims of the Russian authorities and the Wagner leader Prigozhin. It is believed that in the battle for the city, between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian soldiers were killed in total. But Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claims that Ukraine has lost a total of more than 11,000 soldiers, mostly in and around Bakhmut. But according to the data of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Russian losses are many times higher than the losses of the Ukrainian army. Also, Ukrainian authorities claim that about 30,000 of Wagner Group's 50,000 soldiers deserted or were killed or injured. The vast majority of them in and around Bakhmut. On the other hand, the pre-war population of Bakhmut was more than 70,000. But Bakhmut population today is less than 5,000, excluding the warring forces. Nearly all of these loss figures are derived from among the best available sources, though not yet clearly proven. In line with all this data, the largest situation in Bakhmut, which connects Luhansk and Donetsk regions like a bridge and is very important in terms of military logistics, still seems quite critical. But recently Ukrainian forces announced that they hold an important route into and out of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, announcing that the situation in the city is taking their advantage. This striking statement was made by the deputy commander of the Svoboda Battalion, National Guard, Lieutenant Vladimir Nazarenko. According to Vladimir Nazarenko, the Ukrainian armed forces control the Bakhmut and Kostiantynivka highway. The situation is quite stable in this region after these important statements. Nazarenko also denied growing speculation about a possible Ukrainian withdrawal from the city. In other words, the final situation in Bakhmut was to the advantage of the Ukrainians, contrary to what the Russians stated. On the other hand, since the Bakhmut and Kostiantynivka highway is a very important route to transport supplies to the city, the Ukrainians cutting off the Russian forces' supply routes in Bakhmut may have made the situation in the city worse for Putin's forces, because the Russians were already experiencing a serious shortage of military ammunition in Bakhmut, the stronghold of the war. Where a full trench war was going on now with the Bakhmut and Konstantinovka highway under Ukrainian control. Russian troops will not be able to make military supplies to the front lines in this city. This will likely increase the advance of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. Actually, we were not wrong in our predictions. Ukrainian forces had been holding defensive positions in Bakhmut for a long time. The Russians, on the other hand, were complacent about this situation. But after the Ukrainians announced that they had captured the Bakhmut highway, they again took action to carry out counterattack operations in this city. The results of the simultaneous offensive operations, artillery fire, and trench clashes carried out by the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut again caused heavy casualties for the Russians. Following this dramatic offensive, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announced that Russian forces had suffered a total of more than 1,100 casualties in the city of Bakhmut in the past few days, with many more seriously injured. Capturing the city would bring Russia a little closer to its goal of controlling the entire Donetsk region, one of 4 regions in eastern and southern Ukraine that was annexed by Russia after referendums outside Russia that were widely condemned as bogus. However, with the recent offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces, the Russians began to move a little further from these plans. Ukrainian commanders who allocate significant resources to defend the city said their strategy is aimed at binding Russia's forces and preventing Moscow from launching further attacks in the coming months. On the other hand, the commander of the Ukrainian land forces, Colonel General Alexander Svirsky, emphasized that the Russian mercenary Wagner Group attacked his troops from various directions in order to break through the defenses and advance to the central areas of the city. After the successes of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, Russia again accelerated its work on retaliatory attacks in the city. The paramilitary organization is at the center of the Russian attack on Bakhmut. Its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was risking his own reputation and the reputation of his private army to capture Bakhmut. In other words, Ukraine was faced with a danger again in the city of Bakhmut. However, both the defensive and offensive methods employed by the Ukrainian armed forces in Bakhmut caused the Wagner forces to remain passive. Thanks to this, especially now, Wagner Group fighters are probably getting more and more stuck in urban areas. The Wagner Group, which had originally been only a minor supporting element of the Russian campaign, is now helpless in Bakhmut. One of the longest and most brutal battles of the clashes, and the Russians' hand has been weakened. The Wagner Group had to play a lot of political offense in the Kremlin's complex corridors of power to get where it is. But neither did this mercenary unit find a solution to the uncertainty in Bakhmut. The private military company had captured a large part of Soledar, one of the areas around Bakhmut, using human wave attacks. No matter how insignificant their successes were in the overall picture of the war, the Wagner Group seemed far more prominent than the Russian army at this time. However, this did not bode well for the Russian army. Indeed, the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense, namely the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, watched the rise of the Prigozhin and Wagner Group with concern. Bakhmut. The struggle that brought the Wagner Group to the fore could eventually lead to the ruin of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. The latest Western intelligence assessments showed that the private military company lost between 20,000 and 30,000 dead and wounded men in the fight for Bakhmut alone. It seems that the Russian military leadership may be allowing the Wagner Group to spend its forces against the defense of Ukraine, including its best units of contractors with military experience to neutralize mercenary group warfare. Prigozhin, on the other hand, constantly boasts of the skill and dedication of his mercenaries to victory. But in reality, the Wagner Group is putting people on the brink of death and gaining ground, just because of the numbers. But things got worse for the mercenary group, and the Wagner Group's member pool dried up at the beginning of the year. The Wagner Group suddenly lost access to the crowded Russian penal colonies. Prigozhin can no longer go on recruitment tours. In short, the Russian military leadership may be allowing the Wagner Group to inflict high casualties on Bakhmut to erode Prigozhin's influence while simultaneously capturing the city at the expense of Wagner troops.